Hello everybody! Firstly, I want to say a massive thank you to Harry and Josh for having the courage to put this event on digitally. I know it hasn't been easy for them. I'm sad we don't get to meet face to face, but I'm also kind of glad I don't have to go on stage after Vitaly Friedman. But yeah, all jokes aside, I think this is going to be such an enriching and engaging day, and I'm really glad I get to spend it with you. So hi, I'm Charlotte Dann. This talk is Pixels in Real Life. I sometimes describe myself as a creative technologist and maker, but by day I'm mostly a front-end developer at a startup in London called Farewell, but by nights and weekends and Thursdays and Fridays I'm in this space, my studio, where I make generative art and find ways of kind of physicalizing it in the real world. So today I'm going to talk through a few of my projects that kind of cross that boundary and hopefully show you a few ways that you can make physical things with your coding skills as well. But I want to start by questioning the premise of why do we use computers for art anyway? Art is a very expressive medium, and adding this kind of complicated binary middle step of the machine seems kind of incongruous to that process. But I want to argue that actually computers are better adapted to the design process than any kind of traditional medium. In this cycle, if I was designing a table, each iteration, I'd have to start the build step from scratch. But with code, you can build off what you already have before, and you can make as many copies as you'd like along the way. And I think that's kind of magnificent. These are carbon copies, completely infallible, perfect recreations, which is something you just can't get in the physical world. Imagine building a table and having infinite copies of it, or more importantly, being able to think of a variation and have that instantly appear in front of you. It's kind of bonkers. When it comes to making physical things with code, usually this involves writing code to tell a machine how to build something. So there's definitely still a time factor involved there, but it's still just a whole lot less work than building those variations by hand. So I want to start by talking about humble CSS. There's a perception that with generative art, it's all very JavaScript heavy, very math heavy. And I want to kind of lower that barrier for you and kind of also prove to myself that you can make generative art with just HTML and CSS. So here we have a grid, a 10 by 10 grid of white squares. And inside of each square is a circle, a black circle that's twice its size. So it's kind of anchored to the top left at the moment, which is making these kind of white triangulish cutout things. This is already showing a key quality of code that makes generative art possible. We only have to write the styling for this one grid item class once, and it's applied to all of these squares. Let's disregard the fact that I had to write div 100 times. But yeah, anyway, repeatability is the key quality of computers that makes generative art possible. But doing the same thing over and over again can only get you so far. There needs to be some sort of input for Genesis, and often that's randomness or a user input like touch. But I don't want to make CSS art you have to hover over, and we don't have randomness in non-pre-processed CSS. But we do have a pseudo class that can make things look a bit interesting, and that's nth child. So this isn't that much more exciting. It's just anchoring the circle inside every second square to the right, which turns it into semicircles. But if I change that 2n to 3n, we get this pattern, which I think is starting to look really interesting. You can still see that it's a grid of squares, but there's something much more alive about it. And that's the joy of generative art. It's finding these unexpected outputs just by tweaking the input. It's a visual result you didn't expect from writing 3 extra lines of code. With this one, I've added another nth child modifier, which anchors the circle to the bottom in every other square, which means that every 6th square, it's anchored to the bottom right. So by layering up these nth children, we can simulate randomness in these higher orders. So this one to me feels really different from the previous one, and we can keep going and modifying these values. This is just swapping the 2 and 3, completely different aesthetic. This one's 3 and 4, and you get such different patterns each time. So I was playing around with this for a while and trying different amounts of rows and columns as well, and I thought weirdly proud of this. I think it would look really cool, etched into glass or something like that. I want to show it off. But with this, I was kind of going back to basics with this using only CSS. So I thought I'd keep it low level. We are going to talk we're going to get on to all of the cool machines that make digital physical art possible. But I want to take a moment for the humble desktop printer, the powerhouse of the office. It's definitely the most accessible piece of equipment I'm going to be talking about. I think most people have access to a printer, and if not, like small format printing at a print shop is like 10p per A4 sheet. So here I just printed them off in my studio, sandwiched them between some just thin acrylic I got off Amazon, put some nails into the wall and hung them up with binder clips. This was opposite my door when I came into my old studio, and they made me so happy every time I saw them. It made me feel so creative that I generated these interesting shape combinations, even though each of them was only like 20 lines of code. I think it's really easy to forget that computers are a transient medium, like they're constantly mode switching. So we could create something like this and see in a browser and be like, this looks great, I'm really proud of it, and then it, never show up on those pixels again. But if you like make it physical, the power it has is just much more enduring. So the physical presence of having something you've made yourself, decorating your own space, is just like a feeling unlike any other, and it obviously doesn't have to cost a lot. I also still use, I've chucked the acrylic, but you can see on my walls all of my pen plots, which we're going to get onto, just nails and binder clips, and they look great. Pen plotting, something that can cost a lot actually. First off, I need to warn you that if you do get a pen plotter, prepare to spend at least an hour a day just kind of standing over it and watching, because they are extremely hypnotizing. I was tempted to have mine going in the background while I was doing this talk, but I think it would be too much of a distraction for both of us, so I resisted. Pen plotters are mechanical drawing devices. They generally have an X and a Y axis and some device to lift and drop a drawing implement. They were popular in the 70s and 80s for large format printing, especially for architectural and engineering drawings, but they fell out of favour when inkjet printers became cheaper and more efficient. In the last couple of years though, generative artists and hackers have realised how damn cool they are, and they've had a bit of a comeback. You can still get models from the 80s on eBay. Miraculously, they still work. But there's also this company in the US called Evil Mad Scientist who make these high quality models geared specifically towards digital artists. And as far as I can see, nothing really matches the build quality and consistency of them. So I bought this last summer and I love it. It is the A3 AxiDraw. It cost about £550, so fairly hefty investment for a hobbyist, but you can kind of recoup that cost by like never having to buy art again, potentially. But yeah, for me, this is the kind of device that really encourages me to be creative, because I find the output just so tantalizing. I was saying before about how the digital world is distinct from the physical world because it has this perfectly accurate repeatability. But that's kind of a shame, because often it doesn't leave room for serendipity. But with pen plotters, you can have this like millimeter perfect drawing, and you're still going to get these little like spots on the paper where the pen over inks, or when the stock isn't very even, and so it doesn't make like perfectly smooth lines, and you can see the dot where the pen first goes down, and I just find that absolutely gorgeous. When you look at a piece from a pen plotter, you can feel the hours that have gone into it, and I think there's something really special about being able to see the effort that's gone into a piece of art, even if it's just like the effort of time rather than human effort. I think the intention behind the piece is visible, and I think that's just really beautiful. Throughout this talk, I'm going to give a couple of practical tips to point you in the right direction if you want to dip your toe into this world. The first is use Canvas to SVG to get your canvas art into a vector format. So here's an illustration that does a similar thing to the CSS art I printed off earlier. It's a grid where in each square an arc is drawn connecting two corners. So this is using the Canvas API in JavaScript rather than CSS, but kind of does the same thing, much more maths. Don't worry about actually digesting that code. I just kind of like played around with it until I got a pretty pattern. So Canvas allows us to use the GPU to draw primitives really performantly directly into an HTML element in the browser. You can draw rectangles, lines, other types of curves, and then either use fill, which is background color, or stroke, which is an outline color. Yeah, layering these up is how like half of the cool art on the internet is made. So here we make a canvas element, we get the rendering context of that element, and all of the drawing methods are applied to that context. But the canvas element is a raster output. You can actually right click on it in the browser and hit save and it'll download as a PNG, which is awesome if you wanted to like print it off. But for a pen plotter, you need a vector format. So this is where this canvas to SVG npm package comes really in handy. You define a context, which is the same height and width as you would have set on your canvas, and it has all the same methods as a 2D canvas rendering context, but it can output a serialized SVG, which you can then render on the page as inline SVG, or you can download as I have here with this file save utility and hook up to pen plotter. Side note, besides downloading SVG to use for pen plotting, I think there are quite a few cases on the web where for like the developer experience, it's nicer to build in JavaScript using Canvas like this, but actually in the client, it makes more sense to render it as SVG, because then you get all of these automatic wins, like using CSS to control the colors and adding animation, and also you get responsiveness built in, which is kind of a pain in Canvas world. So worth checking that out if you're into web animation. Alternatively, you could use a cool tool like Canvas Sketch. This is a really great project by Matt Delorier. It's a bunch of tools for helping make generative art in the browser. So it takes out a lot of the overhead of setting up a development environment for playing around with creative coding, but it also has a few utilities for exporting SVGs for pen plotting. Next, we're going to talk about laser cutting. Starting with a practical tip that is more of a slide for non-coronavirus times, which is to get access at a hackspace, university, or a pay-by-the-hour facility. Laser cutters are so expensive. The one I had access to at university cost £60,000. You can get cheap ones as low as like 200 quid, but I would really not recommend that. Lasers are very dangerous and they need proper ventilation. And also, the cheaper you go, like the less powerful the laser is. So the thing will take longer to cut, and there are just like a bunch of trade-offs involved. You can get decent laser cutters from a few grand, but you're probably just much better off finding access to a good one. If you are a member of a university that has any kind of design department, they'll usually have a good one with a trained technician, and also even if you're not part of that department, you can often request an induction into it. Otherwise, there are hackerspaces across the globe that have tons of equipment for woodworking, metalworking, digital prototyping, like you name it. They're often based on a monthly subscription for access to like all of the equipment, but also usually a small hourly fee to use the laser cutter because it uses a kind of consumable part. But they're also really community oriented, so a good place to learn new skills, meet new friends that are into similar things. Again, wait till lockdown is over. But yeah, I don't know where you are in the world, but if you are in Leeds, there is a hackspace there, suggested donation of £25 a month, and then £6 now to use the laser cutter. So actually very reasonably priced. So this was a project inspired by a place in Florida called Cape Coral. It's a city with 400 miles of navigable canals, which is crazy. It's like every house is on a canal, and from above it just looks like a total maze. So I made a maze, and then I added a kind of like spilling algorithm to see how the water disperses along the waterways. Mazes, incredibly interesting generative design challenge. If you want to get into creative coding, don't know where to start, or like just more algorithmically minded than design minded, this is an excellent place to start. There's a great book called Mazes for Programmers by Janice Buck, which I would highly recommend. It's in Ruby. I actually just didn't know Ruby when I got it, so I just copied it in JavaScript. But yeah, it's a very accessible and just extremely interesting read. So this project was part of a uni project for my master's in computational arts. For a whole term, we had to spend 1 week making a digital art piece and then the following week kind of physicalizing it. They were on the topic of scale, so this was my response to the environmental scale prompt. We started at astronomical and ended up at, what did we end up at? Microscopic. Yeah. So anyway, almost everybody in my program was either like a hard computer science scientist, all came from a very traditional fine arts background. So almost everyone felt really outside of their comfort zone, having to think about like material. But my bachelor's was actually in jewelry design and silversmithing, so this was just way up my street. So for this, I decided to make my physical response by layering up different colours of laser cut paper. Paper is a really fun thing to laser cut because you can get extremely crisp edges, like you don't see any of the burn marks. You can cut white paper and it will have white edges, and it looks incredible when layered up, but it also is just so fast because it's so thin that you can do really intricate, elaborate things which will take barely any time. I also did some materials tests for this on foam board, which came out quite interesting. So foam board is foam sandwiched between card. So here the laser cutter cut through the card and then kind of like melted the foam, which sort of like retracted it, and it altered the depth in certain areas. Just like a random thing, but I just think it looks pretty cool. Also, this isn't actually generative art, but I just want to show that you can also etch with the laser cutter, which can have really interesting effects on acrylic and wood. So this was a quick drawing I did with a thick marker pen, and I scanned it into a computer. I went over the outline of it in Illustrator, and then I etched the scan onto a bit of wood but cut the outline of each of these marker strips. And then I put those bits on a flatbed scanner and like rearranged them and brought that back into a digital space. So I think that interplay of digital and physical is really exciting. Like you could use tech to further your art or art to further your tech skills, and they can kind of complement each other really well. I'm also really, really into the idea of making generative jigsaw puzzles. This is such an interesting creative coding challenge because you have the printed design to play with, but you also have the opportunity to make a system to cut all of the pieces out. So this photo is not even all of my laser cut tests for this project, because it turns out trying to laser cut a printed material without incurring smoke damage, kind of a pain in the ass. So I just want to take a minute to address the difficulties of making physical things. Making physical things is really rewarding, but it's often like super frustrating because you don't know what sort of complexity is going to be thrown your way, either from the material properties or from the methods of production. For something like this, there are so many moving parts that affect the outcome. It's like, what kind of material do you pick? I tried MDF, plywood, acrylic, 3mm, 5mm. And then for the print, what kind of paper and ink, what kind of mounting agent are you using to print on? Is it lasered face up or face down? Like, which machine are you using? What ventilation does that machine have? Like, there are so many of these factors that can affect the outcome. And I know that code can be super frustrating when you hit problems. Believe me, I know. But code problems can always be solved with like time and willpower. But when you're making physical things, you need willpower, but you also need materials, you need money, you need space, and you also need time. And time's usually at like a broader scale, because you have to physically make the thing. So then this photo is a combination of like 5 months of playing around with these things, which is kind of ridiculous. So this leads to my second tip for laser cutting, which is that you may think you can come in with an idea and your material and come out with like perfect jigsaw puzzle, and that's just not how it works. So lasers have power and speed settings, and they usually have like a list of recommended settings next to the machine for common materials, but you can't trust them 100%. Like even like one corner of the laser bed might have a different strength to another corner of the laser bed. And it's also really hard to know what material is appropriate for your project without kind of trying some first and feeling the output. So I like strongly advise to like come in with a few materials, cut out just like a bunch of circles at a bunch of different settings, so that when you come to do your like final piece, you can be really confident that the cut's going to go well. And also like have fun with it. Pen plotting is magical, yes, but if you had just a very steady hand and enough time, like anyone, we're all human pen plotters. But laser cutting, out of this world incredible. This technology didn't exist 60 years ago, and now you can do it in like any town in the UK for around £6 an hour. Like, that's obscene. Also, I was supposed to launch this weekly generative art jigsaw puzzle project in April, but sadly my laser cutter joint had to close because of the pandemic, so I've had to hold back. But if you want to follow Abstract Puzzles on Instagram, you will be able to follow updates on that, and I hope to see you there. So next up, let's talk about 3D printing. You knew it was coming. There's one right there. So this is my favorite project ever. During my master's in computational arts, we had a class on modeling biological phenomena. So at the end of that term, the kind of like final project was like, just go make something, like it has to be on a screen, and try and use something that you've learned in this class, but you can basically just do whatever you want. So I decided to merge 3 things I come across that I really liked. The first was this drawing program. So there's a book called Generative Design, or Generative Gestaltung was the original in German. It's version 2, and it is amazing. It's this giant chunky textbook with loads of easy to follow creative coding examples. Version 1 was in processing. I think version 2 is in P5 JS. So that's the JavaScript implementation of processing, which is a very kind of common and accessible generative art program. But yeah, anyway, this generative design book has all of these different really interesting examples, and one of them was this, where it was a drawing program based on a Cartesian grid, where you could kind of turn on all of these different like units, and what would be displayed would be based on the active cells around them. So it would have, so each of these things, I think there are like 16 options, is that right? Should have written that one down. So the cell could have like nothing around it, or just a thing to one direction, or could be completely surrounded. So each glyph, I think, had 16 different options for what it would display, which meant that like when you played with it on more than just like one thing, that it would just come out with so many different just like interesting like visual creations. So I wanted to do that, and then I wanted to do it with hexagons, because I thought hexagons, that's more edges, and therefore there'll be more room to make something interesting here. And then I wanted to combine it with some sort of like emergent behavior, so it would kind of make art on its own. So this is Conway's Game of Life. This is a beloved simple biological simulation by the brilliant John Conway. He sadly died recently from complications of COVID-19. And he also hated life. He thought there were way more interesting things that he worked on later in his career, and he was tired of everyone talking about life. So he's probably turning his grave right now, because I'm still talking about life. But RIP John Conway for all of your contributions to mathematics. So yeah, this is the Game of Life. So I thought, let's take the Game of Life and try doing that in hexagons. So the amazing thing about the Game of Life is that it has intrinsic rules and still manages to reach an equilibrium. Like, it never fully dies or fully covers the screen. It's about every generation cells turning on or off based on how many were active around it from the previous generation. So with this hexagon one, like, that didn't quite work because it would die out on its own, so I had to add a little bit of genesis to keep it going. Yeah, good start. So the next step was to, instead of colouring in each active cell, to make something visual with it. So I decided to start quite simply by drawing curves between the active edges. And this is what happened. It was happening all too quickly, which is why I decided to do that kind of like layered fading out effect. But even though this was regenerating too fast for my liking, you can see these flashes of these really interesting like cellular shapes. But there was also this kind of like triangular subgrid that was developing based on these curves. So my next step was to change the way things were rendered. So originally it would be every curve connects, every edge is connected to every edge, but now it would randomly pick like a layout, so it wouldn't be so busy, and there's just like kind of more room for interesting complexity. And at this point I also retired the game of life. I tried out a bunch of different kind of biological simulation type things, and I ended up on this like creator-destroyer dynamic. So there would be one cell that would kind of go along and leave a trail of active hexagons behind it, and then one that would randomly wander around the board and deactivate them as well. The next step, I wanted to add more visual complexity, because although that was cool, I thought, like, let's keep going here. And instead of making a whole new glyphs like in the generative design book, I decided to add just another state to what these hexagons could be. So now they could be inactive, active, or double active, which had this really interesting effect when it went from single active to double active, because these lines would have to kind of converge and diverge. And this is what I ended up with. And kind of like the CSS art, the results, I just like couldn't predict them at all from a relatively simple set of rules that I made for it. I was really surprised by the quality of some of these shapes that it would create. And at this point, I also added some keyboard interaction, so I could see what it was like if you just made a load of things start off at once, and how they would connect to each other. Or if you made like one, but then a bunch of destroying ones, so it wouldn't actually be able to get very far, and see what it would be like to have kind of like these disjointed little bits, because it keeps getting cut up by the destroyers, although these are very unsuccessful destroyers. They're not doing a very good job. Gosh, I love to just watch this program run. I can honestly sit here for like half an hour. Maybe this should be the rest of the talk, is us watching this together solidly. Anyway, part of this keyboard interaction was I also added a mouse element to it, which meant that I could start just drawing bits instead of letting them generate automatically. So this is the point in the talk where I just get really distracted by trying to make pretty shapes. So I spent like a few weeks, just all of my days on this program, just drawing around. And it got to a place where I was like, oh no, I'm making jewelry. I kind of thought I left the jewelry design life behind, but yeah, you can't. It stays with you. I've since realized that not everyone, like I kind of saw jewelry in what I was making, and I've kind of realized that it's not because it inherently relates to jewelry in some way. It's that like everyone kind of like brings themselves to this program. Like I was talking to like a biology PhD student once that could have sworn that I'd made a system for some sort of protein he was working on, which I didn't, and I'm sorry, but it's kind of nice that it just brings out people's interest. For some reason it's like that perfect amount of abstract. But yeah, I kind of realized I had to pursue this more. I needed to make it into jewelry. I couldn't stop here. So this project was over for that term, but I could come back to it for my final major project of the year, which is like the final big thing for your masters, which is like a 3-month focused period over the summer where you work on one thing. And yeah, I decided that for my major project, I would try and realize these dreams. But yeah, the first question was, how do I transform it to jewelry? Like, what does this look like if it was jewelry? And to me, it was like very immediately obvious that these should be wireforms and they should overlap. Like you can already kind of sense I could feel the way that I wanted these lines to interact with each other. So I decided my first step in this process would be to create a 3D visualization of what I wanted. And as I've mentioned in this talk several times, making things is really hard, and I didn't want to be kind of hindered by the practicalities of producing things at this stage. Like, I wanted my creativity to go wild and dream big. I didn't want to constrain myself, so I was like, let's make a 3D visualization and then we'll deal with all of that after. And this is what happened. So first off, I made the demo white because we don't need to live in hackerspace anymore. And the left-hand side is the canvas, while the right-hand side is the visualization. So here we can just kind of drag, and at this point in the talk, there's a lot of pressure for me to make something really beautiful. Oh, actually, doing all right. I'm gonna get rid of a little. Let's make a perfect hexagon. This is nice. All right, and then if you hover over one, you can change the layout of it. This is a very old version and it's quite buggy. But yeah, over here we have a render button. This is the exciting bit. I'm probably not going to be very fast considering I'm screen recording on 2 screens. But yeah, this bit was built with Three.js. It's piping, cubic. All of this data is stored as like cubic Beziers, quadratic Beziers, which is the more complicated one. Quadratic. It's something I really should know by now. So this is Three.js, all quadratic Beziers, and it's just piping them, which is how that animation works. So we've also got like a 3-dimensional element here, and so I'll just explain these 2 sliders at the bottom, which control the way things overlap. So the top one is for layouts that would have clashing lines anyway, like this one here. It picks these sides to always go up and those sides to always go down. So it's just kind of making things weave in and out of each other. And the bottom slider is to pull up the insides of any doubled up lines, which is why this one is really high, because it's doubled up on its own for ages. It kind of smooths out the Z value, so the lines kind of run together. So yeah, I think it was hard to decide like how much control I should give people over this like additional dimension. But I think with these, like a combination of these two sliders, you get like a decent amount of control over something that already is like pretty abstract. So great, I nailed it. I achieved my goal of creating a 3D representation, a quite elegant 3D representation of exactly what I wanted in real life. Now was the point where I had to think about how to physically make the things. It was quite obvious that 3D printers were the direction I should go in, but like how do I even like get that data from my screen into something that I can 3D print? I thought this would be a really hellish process, which is why I avoided it for so long, of like exporting that data in a custom file format and bringing it into my 3D modeling program Rhino, and then rebuilding all of that logic to generate the model. But I didn't have to do any of that, because it turns out that there is an add-on for Three.js which allows you to export STL files directly from Three.js. So STL is a file format that stores 3D objects as triangulated surfaces. So it's a format that 3D printers can understand. And this is absolutely radical, because it means as a JavaScript developer, you can make 3D models without ever touching a 3D modeling program like Blender or SketchUp. And yeah, anyone could do this. You could do this. Why don't you? It still blows my mind. I really hope I've blown some of your minds with that small fact. Yeah, the next thing to figure out was how to print them. So most 3D printers, most desktop 3D printers are extrusion based. So that means they have a reel of plastic and they melt it, and they kind of like poop it out in a line and kind of do that in layers until they build the whole thing. But because I wanted to create these pieces in precious metal, that wasn't really an option. I needed to have a material that I could do lost wax casting in, which is like the traditional silver and gold any metal casting process that is used for most jewelry today. I will explain more about that in a bit. But yeah, I couldn't do that with extrusion-based printers, but I could with a machine like this. This is the Formlabs Form 2. We had a couple at uni. I feel like there's a spoiler for this story in the background of my shot here. But yeah, this works by curing liquid resin. So it has a build plate face down and a tray of resin underneath and a laser underneath that. So the build plate comes down, lasers comes from underneath and like cures that bit of plastic onto the build plate. So it kind of works the opposite direction. But it also means that there are a way wider variety of materials that can be used, because it just needs to be like a photoreactive material rather than one that melts and solidifies at the right temperature. And Formlabs, the company that make this, also at that time had a prototype material that was like a wax-based material so that you could use it directly in lost wax casting. They've now, that's had another evolution, and they have another product as well that's similar and very suited to this lost wax casting process. So yeah, nailed it. This was the first 3D print I did of anything out of this project, and I was worried that because I'm in my studio, I could just bring everything to the camera to show you, and I've held back. And I'm going to hold back, apart from this one piece, because this signifies the bloody world to me. It is so precious, and I remember the feeling of taking this out of the printer and being like, wow, this is going to be exciting. So hold this very close to my heart. In the photo, you can also see the support structure, because you can't kind of cure resin in midair. There needs to be something holding up the overhanging bits of the model, which is why you'd see a lot of these kind of roller coaster tycoon sort of situations in the backgrounds of 3D printed shots. So that was number one. The second group were a bit too fragile, too flimsy, but felt actually really, really delicate, really, really exciting. But the third set just felt right. So this is like the equivalent of having 1 millimeter thick wire. And I think each of the kind of circles was like 6 mil. Why am I guessing? Yeah, so this was kind of the scale that I decided on. And I could talk for hours about how I managed to turn that into metal, and all of the failures I had along the way. But in the interest of time and making this seem more magical, I've shortened down that process to a 2-minute video that we can watch now, and I will talk through. So it starts with the printing, and then the next step I don't actually have to do anymore. This is curing in a UV chamber, which like hardens the material. My new material, I don't have to do that, but it looks bloody cool. Then it's taking off that support structure, all of the excess things that were printed. And then the next step is to add these things called sprues. So the issue with trying to cast something as delicate as these pieces is that the metal would solidify before it got to the end of these delicate structures. So you have to add these kind of channels for the molten metal to run through to get to the like harder to access parts of the model. So you end up with each piece with this like extra tree structure around it. I now 3D print these, which is great because that guy George doesn't have to do them anymore, and he's very happy about that. But yeah, then they get melted onto a stem. So you end up with this whole cylinder of these little weird tree things. And then this gets put in a metal flask, which gets taped up and filled with this stuff called investment, which is kind of like plaster. Then that goes into a kiln and comes out hot red hot, so the wax is all melted away. So you end up with this plaster cylinder with a negative space for where you want the metal to go to. And then the metal gets melted, and then in either a centrifugal or vacuum-based process, the molten metal is forced into those gaps where the wax was. And that's basically how lost wax casting works. That's how probably all the jewelry you're wearing was made, just on a more industrial scale. So then, yeah, that gets cut off the tree. I would bring it back here. I mean, I'd bring it over to there, to my jewelry bench, and cut off all of the extra bits and sand, polish it. This was a pendant, So I put it on chain, and then, yeah, all done. So, woo, I have a production chain. This is fabulous. Right, yeah, so that's what they look like. I'm wearing one now, if you've been able to see it through this whole video. So this is what it looked like when I presented this as my final major project at the end of my master's. I was at a loss as to what to actually call the project. I just hadn't thought about that, but it had to have a name. So I thought back to my first jewelry brand that I ever sold jewelry under, like on Etsy when I was like a teenager, was called Pentatope, which is the simplest 4-dimensional object. So it's 5 points in space all attached to each other. And I was like, maybe I can just go with that, but swap out the pent for hex, because we're dealing with hexagonal related things. And that is the origin of the Hexatope name. So yeah, I displayed the program that people could interact with next to this, some finished pieces that I created from it. I have recommended you make a lot of things in this talk, but I really strongly suggest you never try and make a light up jewelry cabinet. It was almost the end of me. But yeah, seeing people like interact with this program, it was so exciting, because I sort of felt like it was a tool for me to like play around and feel creative and make things for me. But then seeing more people interact with it, it really felt like it was a tool that could make anyone feel creative, especially people that didn't consider themselves artists or designers. Like, they found it really engaging, just having that kind of like co-designing relationship with the machine. So after this, I kind of decided I couldn't stop. I just couldn't give up on this project. I wanted to bring it to the world. So I launched a Kickstarter campaign because I didn't have access to that 3D printer from uni anymore. I had to get my own. And yeah, mercifully successful despite an absolutely ludicrous goal. But all of the rewards, so I got my 3D printer behind me. Isn't it gorgeous? Not mercifully. So the rewards were custom pieces, custom pendants, and these are almost all of the custom pendants I made for the Kickstarter. I thought you couldn't make anything ugly with this program, but people tried. Yeah, I found that the ones that were abstract were much more successful. A lot of people were trying to make like a cross or an initial, which wasn't going to work in this space. But there were also some that just like absolutely blew my mind, and things that weren't even abstract. But I thought I knew this program back to back. Like, I definitely knew all of the like combinations of different things you could do, and yet there was these ones just completely blew me away. And it was really fascinating to see people kind of explore that language of Hexatope and taking their time to perfect their designs. There was also like a surprising kinship between some of them. Like, these two pieces, different people, different parts of the world, they'll never know that that pendant like had a brother and is somewhere else, because they just went so well together. I also love that you can see like my masking tape bandaged up thumb in this photo. It was a time. Anyway, so since the Kickstarter, I have launched the online shop for Hexatope, which you can check out at hexatope.io and design something for yourself or your partner or any sort of loved one. Most of the work I've been doing on it recently has been on the production side. Because the material I'm casting in isn't normal casting wax, the quality of the results are sort of inconsistent. So instead of outsourcing the casting, which I used to do, I've brought every step of the making process in-house, which means I now own 3 kilns, which is a bit excessive. But yeah, it had been pretty slow going, because like similarly to the laser cutting puzzles, like there are so many variables in this process that tweaking each of them to test if they're the thing influencing the quality took so long, because also I could only run this cycle like once a week. But I finally found the actual silver bullet of this process, and I'm now really happy with the quality of the product. So I'm going to be investing a lot more time in Hexatope over the coming months. I'm really excited about it. I also am hoping to launch Hexatope earrings soon, and also rings, cross fingers. I made one ring prototype quite a while ago, which I would bring around to conferences to show people. but I've managed to lose it at some point in the last couple of weeks, which is quite concerning and a big shame. But here is some photo evidence that that does exist, and hopefully there will be many more hextote rings in the future. So yeah, I hope this talk has shown you that it's not too hard to get started making physical things from your coding skills, but also that even something that starts as a bit of like trivial play actually has the potential to become a high quality physical product. Like getting that product to a place that you're happy with may frustrate you beyond belief. But like, trust me when I say that there is nothing more satisfying than that. Thank you so much for watching, and I look forward to chatting to you all in wherever the chat box is. I hope you had a fabulous day. I'm really excited about the rest of the talks happening, and I'm really glad we could all come together for this despite all the circumstances. So thanks a lot. Bye.